Racist waiter spills boiling soup on black elderly woman. Not knowing she owns a restaurant, a beloved customer faces humiliation, but the truth about her identity will leave the waiter reeling. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The lunch rush at Bistro Belle was in full swing, and Jake Winters wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve, balancing 3 plates on his other arm. The restaurant buzzed with the typical midday chaos, clinking silverware, overlapping conversations, and the constant ding of the kitchen bell. At 28, Jake had worked here for 5 years, but his demeanor suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "Table 7's order is getting cold," shouted Marco from the kitchen. Jake rolled his eyes, muttering under his breath as he passed a table where a group of Asian students were studying their menus intently. Great, another table that'll spend an hour deciding and leave no tip. He made no effort to lower his voice, and several nearby diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah, another server, shot him a disapproving look. "Jake, they can hear you." "Like I care," he responded, loud enough for the students to hear. One of them looked up, her face flushing with embarrassment, but Jake had already turned away. The restaurant was packed, with every table filled and a line forming at the door. Jake moved between tables with increasing frustration, his movements becoming more erratic with each passing minute. He'd already received 3 complaints about slow service, and his patience was wearing thin. Near the window, an elderly woman sat with a younger woman who appeared to be in her early 30s. The older woman, Mrs. Thompson, was a regular at the Bistro Belle, though Jake had never bothered to learn her name. She wore a cream-colored blouse and pearl earrings, her silver hair neatly styled. Her companion, Mia, was dressed in business casual attire, her dark skin contrasting elegantly with her yellow blazer. Jake approached their table, barely glancing at them as he reached for Mrs. Thompson's empty water glass. "Ready to order yet?" he asked curtly, his tone suggesting he had better things to do. "Actually," Mrs. Thompson began, her voice warm despite Jake's coldness. "I had a question about the soup of the day dash. It's written on the specials board." Jake interrupted, pointing toward the entrance without looking at her. "French onion." Mia straightened in her seat, her eyes narrowing. "Excuse me, but my grandmother was asking you a question. There's no need to be rude." Jake turned to retort, but at that moment, Marco called out again from the kitchen. "Order up for table 12. Distracted and increasingly agitated, Jake spun around too quickly. The movement caused him to lose his grip on the water pitcher in his hand. In slow motion, it tilted, sending a cascade of ice water across Mrs. Thompson's table. But that wasn't the worst of it. As he tried to recover, he bumped into a passing busboy who was carrying a tray of hot soup bowls. The collision sent scalding French onion soup directly into Mrs. Thompson's lap. The elderly woman's scream pierced through the restaurant's ambient noise. Everything stopped. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Forks froze halfway to mouths. All eyes turned to the scene by the window. Mrs. Thompson stood shakily, the hot soup soaking through her clothes. Her face contorted in pain as Mia quickly grabbed napkins, trying to help her grandmother. "Someone call an ambulance!" Mia shouted, her voice trembling with both concern and anger. Jake stood frozen, his face pale. For the first time that day, perhaps for the first time in years, his arrogant demeanor cracked. He watched as other staff members rushed to help, bringing ice and first aid supplies. The manager appeared from his office, hurrying toward the scene with a look of horror. Mrs. Thompson's eyes met Jake's, and in that moment, he saw something that made him deeply uncomfortable. It wasn't just pain or anger in her gaze. It was disappointment, as if she had expected better from him. The look pierced through his carefully constructed wall of indifference. The restaurant had fallen into a strange hush, broken only by Mrs. Thompson's soft whimpers of pain and Mia's soothing words. Jake felt increasingly isolated as other staff members moved around him, helping the injured woman. He noticed the Asian students from earlier watching the scene, their faces a mixture of shock and recognition. They had just witnessed the same treatment they'd received, but taken to a dangerous extreme. What Jake didn't realize, as he stood there in the midst of the chaos he'd created, was that this moment would mark the beginning of a profound change in his life. He didn't know that Mrs. Thompson was more than just another customer, or that Mia would soon play a crucial role in his journey. All he knew was that something had gone terribly wrong, and for the first time in a long while, he couldn't simply brush it off with a sarcastic comment or an eye roll. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension, and Jake finally moved, stepping back as paramedics entered the restaurant. As they attended to Mrs. Thompson, Jake caught fragments of worried conversations around him. "Did you see what happened? He's always been rude, but this..." Poor Mrs. Thompson. The weight of the situation began to sink in, but Jake still didn't grasp the full implications of what he'd done. He didn't know that this incident would force him to confront not just his actions, but the deeply rooted prejudices that had led him to this point. For now, he simply stood there, watching as Mrs. Thompson was helped to her feet, supported by both Mia and a paramedic, her once pristine outfit now stained and wet, her dignity wounded, but her head held high. The manager's office at Bistro Bell felt smaller than usual as Jake sat in the worn leather chair across from Mr. Peterson's desk. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows through the Venetian blinds, creating bars of light across the incident report that lay between them. The air conditioning hummed, a steady background noise that did nothing to ease the tension in the room. "Do you understand the severity of what happened today?" Mr. Peterson asked, his fingers drumming against the wooden desk. The sound echoed Jake's increasing heartbeat. Jake shifted in his chair, his server's apron still stained with soup. "It was an accident," he said, the words coming out more defensive than he intended. "I didn't mean to spill the soup." "An accident?" Mr. Peterson's voice rose slightly. He pulled out a stack of comment cards from his desk drawer. "Let's talk about the complaints we've received about you in the past month alone." March 15th. Server made inappropriate comments about our accent. March 22nd. Waiter refused to properly explain menu items and made us feel unwelcome. April 3rd. Witness server making racist remarks about other customers. Jake's face flushed, but he maintained his defensive posture. "Those people were just being sensitive. They stop." Mr. Peterson held up his hand. "Mrs. Thompson is one of our most valued customers. She's been coming here every Wednesday for lunch for the past 15 years. She knows every staff member by name, except you apparently, because you've never bothered to learn hers." The revelation that Mrs. Thompson was a regular customer made Jake pause, but he quickly recovered. "Look, I said I was sorry about the soup. What more do you want?" "Sorry." Mr. Peterson leaned forward. "You haven't apologized to anyone, Jake. Not to Mrs. Thompson, not to her granddaughter, not even to the busboy you knocked into. Instead, you stood there like a statue while others cleaned up your mess." Outside the office, the restaurant, NT had returned to its normal rhythm, though the buzz of conversations seemed more subdued. Through the blinds, Jake could see the table where the incident had occurred. A staff member was still cleaning up, replacing the tablecloth and resetting the place settings as if trying to erase what had happened. Mrs. Thompson declined to go to the hospital. Mr. Peterson continued, his voice grave. Her granddaughter took her home to treat the burns. First-degree burns, Jake. Do you understand what could have happened? The liability issues alone. Jake's stomach churned. He hadn't considered the legal implications. Are they pressing charges? That's what this meeting is about. Mr. Peterson picked up his phone and pressed a button. "Send her in, please." The door opened, and Mia walked in. She had changed out of her yellow blazer, now wearing just the white blouse underneath. Her expression was controlled, but Jake could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Miss Thompson has a proposition for you," Mr. Peterson said, gesturing for Mia to take the seat next to Jake. Mia sat down, her posture straight and professional. "My grandmother is not interested in legal action," she began, her voice steady. "She believes in second chances. However, this incident has highlighted a serious problem with your behavior and attitude toward customers." Jake started to speak, but Mia continued. "We've reviewed the security footage from today. We saw how you treated the students at table 5 before the incident. We heard your comments. This isn't just about the soup, Jake." "Wait," Jake asked, confusion crossing his face. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. "What Ms. Thompson is trying to say is my grandmother owns Bistro Bell." Mia interrupted, her eyes fixed on Jake. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. She started this restaurant 40 years ago. She believed in creating a place where everyone would feel welcome, regardless of their background. Jake's world tilted sideways. Every dismissive comment, every roll of his eyes, every muttered slur, they had all been witnessed by the owner herself. The color drained from his face as he realized the full implications of his actions. "Here's the deal," Mia continued, pulling out a folder. "You have two choices. The first is immediate termination, with all incidents documented in your employment record. The second," she paused, sliding the folder across the desk. "The second is that you agree to participate in our community outreach program. It's a series of workshops and discussion groups focused on diversity, inclusion, and cultural sensitivity." Jake stared at the folder, his throat dry. "And if I refuse? Then you're fired," Mr. Peterson said simply. "And good luck finding another service industry job in this city with the kind of documentation we have on your behavior." The weight of the situation finally began to sink in. Jake's carefully constructed world of casual bigotry and dismissive attitudes was crumbling around him. He looked at the folder again, then at Mia, whose expression remained neutral but expectant. "I need your decision by tomorrow morning," Mia said, standing up. "The next workshop starts this weekend." "My grandmother believes people can change, Jake. I'm not so sure, but I'm willing to give you the chance to prove me wrong." As Mia left the office, Jake sat in stunned silence, the folder unopened before him. Through the blinds, he could see the last rays of sunlight fading, casting long shadows across the restaurant floor. The day's events played through his mind on repeat. But now with the devastating knowledge that every misstep, every cruel word, had been witnessed by the very person who could end his career with a single word. The choice before him seemed simple on the surface: keep his job or lose it. But deep down, Jake knew it was more than that. It was a choice between confronting the ugly truth about himself or continuing down a path that had just shown its devastating consequences. The evening air had turned chilly as Jake left Bistro Bell through the back door, his shift finally over. The folder from Mia felt heavy in his backpack, still unopened. He had just pulled out his car keys when a voice cut through the darkness. "We need to talk." Mia stepped out from beside the dumpster where she had been waiting. She had changed into more casual clothes, jeans, and a sweater, but her presence was no less intimidating than it had been in the office. Jake's hand tightened around his keys. "I have until tomorrow to decide, right? So let me think about it." "No," Mia said firmly, moving to block his path to the parking lot. "You're going to listen to me now because I need you to understand exactly what happened today and what's really at stake here." The security light above the back door cast harsh shadows across both their faces. A car passed on the street beyond the parking lot, its headlights briefly illuminating the space between them. "Fine," Jake muttered, leaning against the brick wall. "Talk. Do you know why my grandmother comes to Bistro Bell every Wednesday?" Mia asked, crossing her arms. When Jake didn't respond, she continued, "She sits in that same spot by the window because that's where she served her first customer in 1984. She was one of the first black women to own a restaurant in this neighborhood. People told her she was crazy to even try. They said no one would eat at a black-owned establishment in this part of town." Jake shifted uncomfortably, but Mia pressed on. "The first week she was open, someone broke all the windows. The second week, they left threatening notes. But she kept coming back, every single day, serving anyone who walked through that door with the same smile, the same warmth, regardless of how they treated her." "Look, I get it," Jake interrupted. "I messed up with the soup dash." "No, you don't get it," Mia snapped. "This isn't about the soup. It's about the fact that my grandmother had to watch someone in her own restaurant, someone she pays to represent everything she's built, treat people the exact same way she was treated 40 years ago." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but for once, no quick retort came. "I've been watching you," Mia continued, her voice lowering. "The way you treat international students, the comments you make about Asian customers, how you ignore elderly patrons unless they look like they come from money. You think nobody notices, but we all do. Every single person you've disrespected, every snide comment you've made, it's all been documented." Jake's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "So, Why not just fire me? Why this whole workshop thing? Mia took a step closer, her eyes intense in the security light. Because my grandmother saw something in you today after the accident. For just a moment, when you realized what you'd done, she saw shame in your eyes. Not just fear of getting in trouble, but actual shame. She thinks that means there's hope for you. And what do you think? Jake asked, a hint of his usual sarcasm creeping back into his voice. I think you're a product of your environment, Mia said bluntly. I think someone taught you to hate, and you never questioned it because it was easier not to. I think you hide behind jokes and sarcasm because facing your own prejudices terrifies you. The words hung in the air between them. In the distance, a siren wailed, its sound growing fainter as it passed. The workshop isn't just sensitivity training, Mia explained, pulling out her phone. She pulled up a photo and held it out to Jake. It showed a diverse group of people seated in a circle, engaged in what appeared to be an intense discussion. It's run by former white supremacists, reformed racists, and people who've overcome their own prejudices. People who've been here you are, and found their way out. Jake stared at the photo, his expression unreadable. And you think this will fix me? Make me a better person? No, Mia replied honestly. The workshops don't fix anyone. They just provide a space for people to fix themselves. The real question is, are you brave enough to try? She reached in her bag and pulled out a business card, holding it out to Jake. The first session is Saturday at 10 a.m. The address is on the card. If you don't show up, don't bother coming back to work. If you do show up, she paused, her expression softening slightly. Then maybe my grandmother's faith in people isn't misplaced after all. Jake took the card automatically, his fingers brushing against Mia's. For a brief moment, he felt the weight of everything she'd said pressing down on him. His actions, their consequences, the choice before him. One more thing, Mia said as she turned to leave. The students you insulted today? One of them is working 3 jobs to put herself through medical school. Another volunteers at a homeless shelter on weekends. They're not just customers, Jake. They're people. Start seeing them that way. With that, she walked away, leaving Jake alone in the parking lot. He looked down at the business card in his hand, then at the folder in his backpack. The security light flickered above him, casting alternating patterns of light and shadow, much like the choice he now faced. Stay in the comfortable darkness of his prejudices, or step into the uncomfortable light of change. The community center looked nothing like Jake had imagined. Located in a converted warehouse, its red brick exterior was covered in vibrant murals depicting people of different ethnicities holding hands. He sat in his car for 20 minutes, watching people enter the building, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. 10:07 a.m. He was already late. This is stupid, he muttered, but reached for his door handle anyway. The alternative, unemployment and a ruined reputation, pushed him forward. The meeting room was arranged in a circle of chairs, just like in the photo Mia had shown him. About 15 people were already seated, their conversations dying down as Jake entered. He recognized a few faces from around town, including, to his shock, David Chun, the owner of the successful tech startup downtown. Welcome, said a tall man with graying hair and arms covered in faded tattoos. I'm Marcus. Take any empty seat. Jake slid into a chair near the door, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor. The smell of coffee and donuts from a side table did nothing to settle his churning stomach. Today, Marcus began, we're talking about moments of realization. Those instances when we first recognized our own prejudices, and more importantly, when we first wanted to change. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a partially covered swastika tattoo. Mine came in an emergency room, when the doctor who saved my life was a black man. Jake's eyes darted to the exit. This was too much, too real. But before he could move, David Chin spoke up. I'll go next, he said, leaning forward in his chair. Most people know me as a successful businessman now, but 10 years ago, I was angry at the world. I believed every racist stereotype about white people holding Asians back. I let that anger consume me until I became exactly what I hated, someone who judged others based on their race. The room fell silent. Jake found himself unwillingly drawn into David's story, recognizing pieces of his own anger in the narrative. "What changed?" someone asked. David smiled sadly. "I had an employee, white guy, fresh out of college. He stayed late every night helping me fix coding problems, believed in my company when no one else did. One day, I overheard him defending me to an investor who'd made a racist comment. That's when I realized I'd been so focused on hating an entire group of people, I'd missed seeing them as individuals." More stories followed. A former neo-Nazi who now ran diversity training programs. A woman who had overcome her prejudice against Middle Eastern people after being helped by a Muslim family during a crisis. Each story stripped away another layer of Jake's defensive shell. Then Marcus turned to him. "What about you, Jake? What brought you here?" Jake felt every eye in the room turn toward him. His throat tightened. "I spilled soup on an old lady," he said, trying to make it sound like a joke. Nobody laughed. "And?" Marcus prompted. The words started spilling out before Jake could stop them. "I've worked at her restaurant for 5 years. She comes in every Wednesday, sits in the same spot, and I never even learned her name. I treated her like she was invisible, just like I treated everyone else who didn't look like me." He paused, the realization hitting him as he spoke. "I made assumptions about every person who walked through those doors. The Asian students wouldn't tip. The elderly would be too demanding. The black customers would be too loud. I never once thought about their stories, their lives. I never." His voice cracked. "I never thought about how my grandmother would feel if someone treated her the way I treated Mrs. Thompson." The room remained quiet, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that comes with recognition, with understanding. David Chun spoke up again. "The hardest part isn't recognizing our prejudices. It's admitting that we've wasted so much time and energy hating people we never took the time to know." Jake thought about all the customers he'd dismissed, all the stories he'd never heard because he decided he already knew everything about them based on their appearance. He thought about Mrs. Thompson, building her restaurant despite the broken windows and threats, serving everyone with the same smile he'd taken for granted. "There's something else," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "After I spilled the soup, when everyone was helping her, I saw they looked at me. And for the first time, I recognized that look. It's the same look I've given to others. Like they're less than human. Like they don't deserve basic respect." Marcus nodded. That mirror moment, when we see ourselves through others' eyes and don't like what we see. The discussion continued, but Jake's mind was elsewhere. He remembered every dismissive comment, every rolled eye, every muttered slur. But now, instead of defending those actions, he felt the weight of them. Each memory came with a face, a person he'd never bothered to know, a story he'd never bothered to hear. As the session ended, David Chin approached him. "First step's the hardest," he said, handing Jake a business card. "If you want to talk, call me. Sometimes it helps to hear from someone who's been there." Jake took the card, noticing his hands were shaking slightly. The morning sun streaming through the windows caught the edge of Marcus's tattoo. Not the swastika, but the word he had tattooed over it. Change. For the first time since the incident with Mrs. Thompson, Jake felt something beyond fear or shame. It was something closer to hope, fragile and uncertain, but present nonetheless. The comfort of his prejudices had been replaced by the discomfort of truth. And surprisingly, he found himself choosing to sit with that discomfort rather than run from it. The morning rush at Bistro Bell felt different after Jake's first workshop session. Every interaction now carried the weight of his newfound awareness. He stood at the service station, watching customers enter, catching himself before making his usual assumptions. "Table 6 needs coffee," Sarah said, hurrying past with a loaded tray. She'd been keeping her distance since the incident, treating him with a cold professionalism that highlighted how many bridges he'd burn. "Ned." Jake grabbed the coffee pot and approached table 6, the same group of Asian students he'd dismissed days earlier. His hands felt clammy as he recognized one of them as the girl who'd flushed with embarrassment at his previous comments. "Would anyone like coffee?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. The students glanced up, recognition and wariness in their eyes. The girl he'd embarrassed spoke first. "Yes, please," she said quietly, turning her cup over. As Jake poured, he noticed the medical textbook open in front of her. Mia's words echoed in his mind. One of them is working 3 jobs to put herself through medical school. Are you studying medicine? The question came out before he could stop himself. She looked surprised at his interest. Yes, pediatric oncology. Cancer treatment for kids, another student explained, clearly expecting Jake not to understand. That must be challenging, Jake said, remembering David Chin's words about seeing people as individuals, especially while working. 3 jobs, she finished, a small smile appearing. But it's worth it. My little brother had leukemia when we were young. The doctors who saved him. I want to do that for other families. Jake stood there, coffee pot frozen midair, as her words sank in. Every assumption he'd made about these students crumbled in the face of her simple story. He thought about how many other stories he'd missed, how many lives he'd dismissed with a sneer or a snide comment. Throughout his shift, Jake made conscious efforts to change his behavior. When an elderly couple asked about the menu, he pulled up a chair and took time to explain each dish. When a group of Middle Eastern businessmen came in speaking Arabic, he resisted his usual eye roll and instead focused on providing attentive service. But change wasn't easy. Old habits emerged without warning. He caught himself making assumptions, starting to form cruel jokes in his mind. Each time, he had to consciously stop. Remember the workshop. Remember Mrs. Thompson's disappointed face. During the afternoon lull, Mia appeared at the restaurant. She sat at the bar, observing as Jake worked. He felt her eyes on him, measuring every interaction, every response. You went to the workshop, she said when he approached to take her order. It wasn't a question. Yes. Jake wiped his hands on his apron, unexpectedly nervous. I met David Chin there. He's one of our success stories, Mia nodded. But transformation isn't just about attending one session and having an epiphany. It's about the small choices you make every day. As if on cue, a loud group entered the restaurant, their laughter filling the space. Jake turned to see several black teenagers in school uniforms, probably from the private academy down the street. His old self would have immediately complained about them being too loud, would have provided minimal service. Instead, he remembered Marcus's words from the workshop. Every interaction is a chance to prove who you want to be, not who you were. Jake approached their table with menus. Welcome to Bistro Bell, he said, making eye contact with each student. Are you celebrating something special today? Math competition, one boy answered, his smile wide. Jason here, just won first place. Regional champions, another added proudly, pointing to their school badges. Jake felt Mia watching as he engaged with the students, asking about their competition, congratulating their success. The interaction felt natural, genuine, nothing like the forced politeness he'd hidden behind before. But not everyone was convinced by Jake's attempts at change. Later that afternoon, he overheard 2 other servers talking in the kitchen. He's just putting on a show, one whispered. People don't change that fast. Probably scared of getting fired, the other agreed. Their words stung, but not for the reasons they might have expected. Yeah, Ka realized he wasn't angry at their doubt. He deserved it. What hurt was knowing they were right. People don't change overnight. The real work was just beginning. During his break, Jake sat in the empty dining room, looking at the spot where he'd spilled soup on Mrs. Thompson. He pulled out his phone and opened the notes he'd started taking at the workshop. Today, caught myself prejudging table 12. Stopped. Ask questions instead. Remember, everyone has a story. Medical student working 3 jobs, math champions celebrating David Chin's employee who stayed late next workshop Saturday. Bring journal? Mia approached as he was writing. My grandmother asks about you, she said, sitting across from him. She wants to know if her faith was misplaced. Jake looked up from his notes. What do you tell her? The truth. That you're trying. That it's too soon to tell if it will stick. She paused, studying his face. The hardest part is still coming, you know? Real change isn't just about being polite to customers. It's about confronting the deep-seated beliefs that made you act that way in the first place. Jake nodded, thinking about the discussions at the workshop, about Marcus's cover tattoo, about David Chin's journey. I know, he said quietly. I'm starting to understand that this isn't just about keeping my job anymore. Mia's expression softened slightly. That's a good start. But remember, actions speak louder than words. My grandmother built this place as a haven for everyone. If you want to keep working here, you need to help maintain that legacy, not undermine it. As Mia left, Jake returned to his notes, adding one more line. Question for next workshop. How do you earn back trust after you've broken it? The answer, he suspected, would take much more than one session to discover. The community center buzzed with activity as Jake helped set up chairs for Mrs. Thompson's annual Breaking Bread, Building Bridges event. 3 weeks had passed since his first workshop, and each Saturday session had peeled back another layer of his prejudices, exposing raw truths he was only beginning to process. Those chairs need to be arranged in small groups, Mia directed, consulting her clipboard. We want to encourage conversation. She'd been surprised when Jake volunteered to help with setup, but she'd accepted his offer with cautious optimism. The main hall had been transformed. Round tables dotted the space, each decorated with flowers and name cards carefully designed to seat people of different backgrounds together. The walls displayed photographs from the restaurant's history, including one that made Jake pause. Mrs. Thompson standing proudly in front of Bistro Belle's original storefront, the windows behind her boarded up after being broken. First time seeing that photo? David Chin appeared beside him, carrying a box of programs. Jake nodded. I never knew about any of this. 3 weeks ago, I wouldn't have cared to know. That's why she's having you set up near the stage, David said, gesturing to where Jake had been arranging chairs. You're part of tonight's program. Jake's stomach dropped. What? Mrs. Thompson thinks your story needs to be heard. David set down the box. Real change isn't just about personal transformation. It's about helping others recognize their own biases. Before Jake could protest, the doors opened and people began arriving. The diversity of the crowd was striking. Elderly residents, young professionals, families with children, people of all backgrounds and faiths. Jake recognized many faces from the restaurant, including some customers he'd previously treated with disdain. The medical student and her study group arrived, now familiar faces after becoming regular customers at his section. They waved, and Jake felt a small surge of pride at how far that relationship had come from his first cruel assumptions. Mrs. Thompson made her entrance last, suppo, root by Mia. The burns from the soup incident had healed, but she moved more carefully now. The room fell silent as she approached the podium, her presence commanding respect without demanding it. Welcome, she began, her voice warm but strong. 40 years ago, when I opened Bistro Belle, many people told me I was making a mistake. They said this neighborhood wasn't ready for a black-owned business. They said I was asking for trouble. She paused, surveying the room. But I believed then what I believe now, that food has the power to bring people together, that sharing a meal can break down walls we build between us. Every act of hatred directed at my restaurant was met with an act of love from this community. Jake shifted in his seat, feeling the weight of his past actions more heavily with each word. Recently, Mrs. Thompson continued, an incident at my restaurant reminded me why this work remains so important. It would have been easy to respond to that incident with anger, with punishment. But easy responses rarely lead to meaningful change. She gestured toward Jake, and he felt every eye in the room turn to him. Tonight, we'll hear from someone who's beginning a journey many of us have taken. The journey from prejudice to understanding. Jake, his legs felt like lead as he approached the podium. The index cards in his pocket, filled with carefully prepared words, suddenly seemed inadequate. As he reached for them, a voice cut through the silence. This is ridiculous. Jake turned to see Robert, one of his former co-workers from Bistro Belle, standing up. Are we really going to sit here and pretend he's changed? I worked with him for 2 years. I heard every racist joke, every slur, every comment about customers. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jake saw several people nodding in agreement. 3 weeks of sensitivity training doesn't erase years of bigotry, Robert continued. He's just putting on a show to save his job. Mrs. Thompson, you're being naive, that's enough. Mrs. Thompson's voice cut through the tension. She turned to Jake, her eyes kind but challenging. Perhaps this is exactly the moment we need. Jake, forget your prepared speech. Speak from your heart. Respond to what Robert has said. Jake stared at the crowd, his prepared notes useless in his pocket. He saw doubt in some faces, hope in others, and genuine curiosity in most. The medical student gave him an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, he stepped up to the microphone. His hands were shaking, but his voice was steady as he began to speak, not from his cards, but from the truth he'd been learning to face. The room held its breath, waiting to see whether this moment would prove Robert right about the impossibility of change, or demonstrate something more hopeful about human nature's capacity for transformation. The microphone hummed with feedback as Jake adjusted it, his prepared speech forgotten in his pocket. Robert's words hung in the air, along with the unspoken question everyone was thinking. Can someone really change? Robert's right, Jake began, his voice barely steady. The admission sparked surprised murmurs through the crowd. 3 weeks ago, I was exactly the person he described. I made those jokes. I used those slurs. I treated people like they were beneath me because of their race, their age, their accent. He paused, making eye contact with Robert. And you're also right that 3 weeks of workshops doesn't erase years of bigotry. I won't stand here and claim I'm completely transformed. That would be a lie. Mrs. Thompson leaned forward in her chair, her expression unreadable. Mia stood beside her, arms crossed, watching intently. But I will tell you what these 3 weeks have taught me. Jake's voice grew stronger. I've learned that my grandmother grew up in the same neighborhood as Mrs. Thompson, while Mrs. Thompson was having her windows broken for daring to open a restaurant. My grandmother was teaching me that people who looked different from us were the enemy. The room fell silent. Even Robert sat down, his anger tempered by surprise at Jake's candor. I carried those lessons with me for 28 years. I never questioned them because questioning them meant questioning everything I thought I knew about myself and the world. Jake gestured to the medical student and her friends. 3 weeks ago, I saw these students as walking stereotypes. I never bothered to learn that one of them works 3 jobs to become a pediatric oncologist. I never knew that another volunteers at a homeless shelter. He turned to face Robert directly. You watched me be that person for 2 years, and you never said anything. Maybe you were afraid of confrontation. Maybe you thought it wasn't your problem. Or maybe you just didn't want to make waves. I get it. I was comfortable in my hatred, and everyone around me was comfortable letting me stay that way. Some people in the audience shifted uncomfortably, recognition flickering across their faces. Then I spilled soup on Mrs. Thompson. Jake's voice cracked slightly. It was an accident, but it happened because I was too busy making snide comments about other customers to pay attention to what I was doing. In that moment, when I saw her pain, something broke inside me. Not just guilt about the accident, but something deeper. He looked at Mrs. Thompson, meeting her steady gaze. I learned later that you'd heard every racist joke, seen every eye roll, witnessed every moment of disrespect I showed to your customers. But instead of firing me, you saw something worth saving. I'm still trying to understand why. Mrs. Thompson nodded slowly, encouragingly. These past 3 weeks haven't erased my prejudices, Jake continued, but they've forced me to face them. Every day, I catch myself making assumptions. Every day, I have to consciously choose to see people as individuals with their own stories, their own struggles, their own dreams. He pulled out his phone, opening his workshop notes. I've been keeping a journal. Every time I catch myself slipping into old patterns, I write it down. Every time I learn something that challenges my preconceptions, I write that down too. Would you like to hear some entries? Without waiting for a response, he began reading. Day 3. Caught myself assuming an elderly couple couldn't afford the expensive wine. They were celebrating their 50th anniversary. They ordered 2 bottles. Day 7. Wanted to make a joke about a customer's accent. Remembered how Mrs. Thompson must have felt hearing my jokes about her customers. Kept my mouth shut. Asked about their day instead. Day 12. Met a Syrian refugee at the workshop. He was a surgeon in his country. Now he works as a janitor and studies English at night. I used to complain about immigrants taking our jobs. His story made me realize how little I understand about what people sacrifice to come here. Jake looked up from his phone. These aren't grand revelations. They're small moments of recognition, little chips in the wall of prejudice I built around myself. And yes, Robert's right. 3 weeks isn't enough to tear down that wall completely. But I'm not standing here claiming to be cured. I'm standing here admitting that I'm trying to be better, knowing I'll make mistakes, but committed to learning from them. He turned back to the audience. Mrs. Thompson didn't just give me a second chance. She gave me a mirror, forcing me to see myself as others saw me. The reflection was ugly, but pretending not to see it wouldn't make it any less true. Mrs. Thompson slowly rose from her chair, making her way to the podium. The room held its breath as she reached Jake's side. "When those people broke my windows 40 years ago," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "I had a choice. I could have let hatred win, could have closed my restaurant and given up everything. Instead, I chose to believe that people could change, that understanding could triumph over ignorance." She placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "Some will say I'm naive. Perhaps I am, but I've lived long enough to see former Klan members march for civil rights, to see people overcome generations of taught hatred. Change isn't just possible, it's essential for our survival as a community." The tension in the room began to dissolve, replaced by something more contemplative. Even Robert's expression had softened, though doubt still lingered in his eyes. "The journey from prejudice to understanding isn't a straight line," Mrs. Thompson concluded. "It's a daily choice, a constant effort. Jake isn't finished with his journey. None of us are. But his willingness to confront his own biases publicly, to acknowledge his ongoing struggle, shows more genuine change than any perfectly polished speech could have demonstrated." The silence that followed was broken by the medical student, who stood up and began to applaud. Others joined, not in celebration of a completed transformation, but in recognition of an honest beginning. A month after the community event, Bistro Bell had undergone subtle but significant changes. The restaurant's walls now featured photographs from its history, including the image of Mrs. Thompson in front of the boarded-up windows. Below each photo, a small plaque told part of the restaurant's story, transforming the space into a living testament to resilience and change. Jake stood by the service station, watching the breakfast crowd filter in. The medical student, he now knew her as Dr. Kim, soon-to-be, was at her usual table, surrounded by textbooks. She'd started a study group that met regularly at the restaurant, and Jake had helped arrange a quiet corner specifically for them. "Your regulars are here," Sarah said, walking past with a coffee pot. Her tone had changed over the weeks. Not quite friendly yet, but no longer cold. She'd been watching Jake's efforts with cautious interest. At a corner table, Robert sat with Marcus from the workshop and 3 other servers from Bistro Bell. What had started as confrontation at the community event had evolved into weekly discussion sessions. Robert, still skeptical but willing to engage, had become an unexpected catalyst for change within the staff. "We need to talk about something," Robert said as Jake approached their table. "There's a situation you should know about." Jake pulled up a chair, noting the serious expressions around the table. "What's wrong? Remember Tommy? The line cook who quit last month?" Robert glanced around before continuing. "He's been posting things online about the restaurant, calling it too woke now. Says we're betraying our traditional customers." Jake felt a familiar tension rise in his chest. The old instinct to dismiss, to defend, to deflect. Instead, he took a deep breath, remembering his workshop training. "What are people saying about it?" "That's just it," Marcus interjected. "Some customers are agreeing with him. They're saying the restaurant's changed, that it's not the same place anymore." "Isn't that the point?" Sarah had appeared behind them, coffee pot still in hand. "It's not supposed to be the same place it was when we let prejudice go unchallenged." Mrs. Thompson, who had been quietly observing from her usual window seat, made her way to their table. "Perhaps," she said, settling into a chair, "this is an opportunity rather than a crisis." The group turned to her, waiting. Over the past month, they'd learned to appreciate the wisdom in her measured responses. "When I opened this restaurant," she continued, "people said I was changing the neighborhood too much. They were right, Change is uncomfortable. It makes people defensive, but discomfort can be a catalyst for growth." She gestured around the restaurant. At one table, the medical students were helping an elderly couple understand their phone's translation app. At another, a group of businessmen, regular customers Jake had once dismissed, were sharing breakfast with some of the neighborhood's homeless residents, part of a new weekly program the restaurant had started. Tommy's reaction, Mrs. Thompson said, comes from the same place Jake's original behavior did: fear. Fear of change, fear of losing something familiar, even if that familiar thing was harmful. Jake nodded slowly. So how do we address it? We already are, Mia said, joining the conversation. She pulled out her tablet, showing them the restaurant's social media page. Customers had been sharing stories about their experiences at Bistro Belle. Not just recent ones, but going back years. Stories of kindness, of welcome, of community. See these comments? She scrolled through responses to Tommy's posts. For every negative reaction, there are 3 people defending what we're doing. Not just defending, celebrating it. The medical student approached their table, having overheard the conversation. My study group posted about this place last week, she said, about how it's become more than just a restaurant. We've had students from other schools asking to join our study sessions here. That's exactly my point, Mrs. Thompson smiled. Change doesn't happen in isolation. When one person begins to transform, it creates ripples. She turned to Jake. Your journey hasn't just been about personal growth. It's shown others that change is possible. Some, like Tommy, will resist, but others will see the possibility of transformation in their own lives. The breakfast rush continued around them, but the atmosphere had shifted. Servers who once worked in isolated silence now exchanged greetings, shared stories about their customers, helped each other without being asked. The invisible barriers that had once divided the staff along racial and cultural lines were slowly dissolving. We're starting something new, Mia announced, pulling out a folder. Monthly community dinners like the event last month. But instead of just talking about change, we're going to create opportunities for it. Mentorship programs, language exchange meetings, cultural celebration nights. She handed out schedules. We want every staff member involved, not just serving food, but sharing their own stories, their own journeys. Jake studied the schedule, noting how it incorporated elements from his workshop experiences. What about resistance? People like Tommy won't just disappear. No, Mrs. Thompson agreed, they won't. But neither will we. Every person who chooses growth over comfort, understanding over ignorance, makes it easier for others to do the same. The morning sun streamed through the windows, highlighting the photographs on the walls, each one a chapter in the restaurant's ongoing story. Jake realized that his own journey had become part of that story, not as a simple tale of redemption, but as evidence that change, however difficult, was always possible. So, Robert said, a hint of his old skepticism mixing with new understanding. What's our next step? Mrs. Thompson smiled, gesturing to the growing crowd in the restaurant. We keep doing what we've always done. We serve, we listen, we learn. But now we do it consciously, intentionally, knowing that every interaction is an opportunity for transformation. The medical student raised her coffee cup in a small salute. To transformation, she said. Around the table, others raised their cups, even Robert. To transformation, they echoed, their voices blending with the morning bustle of a restaurant that was becoming more than just a place to eat. It was becoming a catalyst for change in a community ready to grow. The weekly discussion group had moved from the restaurant to the community center, growing too large for Bistro Belle's corner table. Tonight's session focused on origins, understanding the root, TS of prejudice in their own lives. Jake sat nervously in the circle, knowing his turn to speak was approaching. Mia had joined these sessions recently, her initial skepticism gradually turning to genuine interest in the participants' stories. She sat across from Jake, notebook open, her role shifting from overseer to active participant. Jake, Marcus said, nodding in his direction. You've been quiet tonight. Would you like to share? The room fell silent. Over the past 2 months, Jake had shared fragments of his past, but never the complete story. He glanced at the door, his usual escape route, but instead took a deep breath and began to speak. I found something yesterday, he said, pulling a worn photograph from his wallet. I was cleaning out my grandmother's house. She passed last year, and this was hidden in an old Bible. He passed a photo around. It showed a young black woman in a nurse's uniform, standing beside a white woman who bore a striking resemblance to Jake's grandmother. They were smiling, arms around each other's shoulders. That's my grandmother, Jake said, pointing to the white woman. And the other woman, her name was Ruth. I found letters they exchanged, dozens of them, spanning almost a decade. They worked together at the city hospital in the 1960s. Mia leaned forward, studying the photo when it reached her. They looked close. They were best friends, Jake continued, his voice tight. The letters talked about their dreams, their struggles, their families. Ruth helped my grandmother through her first pregnancy, my father. But then, he paused, gathering himself. In 1968, there was a riot in our city after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. The hospital was understaffed, and Ruth stayed late to help. On her way home, his voice cracked. She was attacked by a group of white men. She didn't survive. The room remained silent, but the air felt heavy with shared pain. My grandmother changed after that. The letters stopped abruptly. The photo was hidden away. She never talked about Ruth, but she talked plenty about them, how they couldn't be trusted, how they were dangerous, how we needed to protect ourselves. Understanding dawned on Mia's face. She turned her grief into hatred. Jake nodded. She raised my father with those beliefs, and he raised me with them. I never knew about Ruth until yesterday. I never understood why my grandmother was so bitter, so angry. She took her best friend's death and twisted it into a justification for racism. Robert, who had become a regular at these sessions, spoke up. But why share this now? Because, Jake said, retrieving the photo, I realized something. Mrs. Thompson and Ruth were the same age. While Ruth was helping my grandmother at the hospital, Mrs. Thompson was fighting to keep her restaurant open. They were both just trying to live their lives, to help others, to make things better. He turned to Mia. When I spilled that soup on your grandmother, when I saw the disappointment in her eyes, it reminded me of something. I'd seen that same look in old photos of my grandmother, not the bitter woman I knew, but the young nurse who smiled with her best friend. Somewhere along the way, she lost that light, and she taught me to live in that darkness. Marcus nodded slowly. Trauma can be inherited. So can hatred. But so can healing. I keep thinking, Jake continued, about what my grandmother's life might have been like if she'd chosen a different path after Ruth's death. If she'd turned her grief into something positive like Mrs. Thompson did with her struggles. Instead, she let it poison 3 generations. Mia wrote something in her notebook, then looked up. Do you blame her? No, Jake said after a moment. I understand her pain now, but understanding doesn't mean accepting. She made a choice about how to handle her trauma, and that choice affected not just her, but everyone around her. I'm making a different choice. The photo made its way back to Jake. He studied it one last time before carefully returning it to his wallet. Ruth's family still lives in the city. I found her daughter yesterday. She's a teacher now. I'm meeting her next week to give her the letters, to share this piece of her mother's life she never knew about. Are you ready for that conversation? Marcus asked gently. Jake shook his head. No, but I need to do it anyway. My grandmother never confronted her grief, never dealt with her trauma. She just passed it on. I want to break that cycle. Mia closed her notebook. You know this won't be easy. You're not just confronting your own prejudices anymore. You're confronting generations of pain on both sides. I know, Jake said, but maybe that's what real change is about. Not just changing ourselves, but understanding how we got here in the first place. And maybe, he touched his wallet where the photo lay hidden, maybe finding ways to heal old wounds, even if we didn't create them. The group sat with this revelation, each person reflecting on their own inherited biases, their own family histories of pain and prejudice. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the community center windows. But inside, in that circle of trust and understanding, something was becoming clear. The path to change wasn't just about moving forward. It was about facing the past with open eyes and an honest heart. The annual charity gala at Bistro Belle was in full swing. The restaurant had been transformed, with white tablecloths gleaming under soft lighting and the walls adorned with photos documenting its 40-year history. Jake moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his service now marked by genuine warmth rather than forced politeness. Everything needs to be perfect tonight, Mia had stressed during the pre-event briefing. This isn't just a fundraiser, it's a celebration of how far we've come. The guest list was diverse. Regular customers, community leaders, workshop participants, and even some of Jake's former critics who'd begun to acknowledge his transformation. Dr. Kim, no longer just the medical student, sat with her study group, now expanded to include students from various backgrounds. Robert worked the room alongside Jake, their former antagonism replaced by a tentative friendship. Jake was serving appetizers when he heard a familiar voice that made him freeze. Well, if it isn't St. Jake, the reformed racist. He turned to face Amanda Carter, his former girlfriend from 3 years ago. She stood near the bar, elegant in a black dress, but with a sharp edge to her smile that he remembered all too well. "Amanda," he said carefully, "I didn't know you were on the guest list." "Oh, I made sure to get an invitation when I heard about this little celebration." She raised her phone, showing a social media post about the event. "Quite a transformation you've had. From calling people racial slurs to becoming a champion of diversity. How convenient." Several nearby guests turned to listen. Jake felt the weight of their attention, along with a familiar surge of shame about his past behavior. "People can change, Amanda," he said quietly. "Can they?" Her voice carried across the room. "Should I show everyone the texts you used to send? The jokes you used to make? The things you used to say about Mrs. Thompson's kind taking over the neighborhood?" The room grew quiet. Jake saw Mrs. Thompson and Mia approaching from across the restaurant, but Amanda wasn't finished. "I've kept everything," she continued, her voice rising. "Every racist comment, every hateful message. Should I read them aloud? Let everyone see the real Jake." He felt the room's energy shift, saw doubt creep into faces that had begun to trust him. Even Robert looked uncertain. "The real Jake?" Mrs. Thompson's voice cut through the tension as she reached them. "My dear, you're looking at the real Jake right now. The person in those messages was the facade." Amanda turned to Mrs. Thompson, momentarily thrown off balance. "You don't know what he's really like." "I do. I was with him for 2 years. He hasn't changed. He's just getting better at hiding who he really is." "No," Jake said, finding his voice. "You knew who I was pretending to be. The person who sent those messages was living in a darkness passed down through generations. But that's not an excuse. It was still my choice to perpetuate that hatred." He looked around the room, at the faces watching this confrontation unfold. "Every message you saved, every hateful word I spoke, I own them. I'm not proud of them, but I don't deny them either. They're part of my journey." "A journey?" Amanda laughed bitterly. "You burned crosses in people's yards in college, Jake. Remember that? Want me to show everyone those photos?" A collective gasp went through the room. Jake felt the floor shift beneath his feet, saw the horror on people's faces. But before he could respond, an unexpected voice spoke up. "I was at those cross burnings." Marcus stepped forward from the crowd. "I was there 20 years before Jake was born. I helped organize them. And now..." He rolled up his sleeve, showing his transformed swastika tattoo. "Now I teach others how to escape that hatred. Are you saying people like me don't deserve a chance to change?" Amanda faltered, but quickly recovered. "This is different. He's just doing this to keep his job, to look good for the community. It's all an act." "Is it?" Mia stepped forward, opening her notebook. "For the past 3 months, I've documented every interaction Jake has had in this restaurant. Not just the public ones, but the private moments too. Like when he stayed late to help Dr. Kim's study group prepare for their exams. Or when he used his own money to pay for meals for homeless customers. Or when he drove across town to deliver food to a former critic who was sick." She turned to Amanda. "You've kept records of who Jake was. We've kept records of who he's becoming." Mrs. Thompson moved to stand beside Jake. "My dear, you came here tonight hoping to expose Jake's past. But in doing so, you've only highlighted how far he's come. Those messages you saved, they show where he started. This room, these people, this community, they show where he is now." Amanda looked around, seemingly noticing for the first time how many people were standing with Jake, not against him. She saw the medical students, the workshop participants, the regular customers, all watching with expressions that held not judgment, but understanding. "You don't get it," she said, but her voice had lost its edge. "People like him don't change. They just get better at hiding who they really are." "No, Amanda," Jake said softly. "People like me do change. But it's not easy, and it's not pretty, and it's never finished. Every day, I have to choose to be better than I was yesterday. Sometimes I fail. Sometimes the old thoughts creep back in, but I face them now, instead of hiding behind them. He reached in his wallet and pulled out the photo of his grandmother and Ruth. This is who I really am. Someone trying to break a cycle of hatred that's been passing through generations. Someone learning that it's never too late to choose a different path. The room was silent as Amanda studied the photo. Something in her expression shifted. Not acceptance, exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. "The food's getting cold," Mrs. Thompson announced, breaking the tension. "And this is, after all, a celebration. Amanda, you're welcome to stay. Not to witness and expose, but to see what real transformation looks like. It's not in grand gestures or public confessions. It's in daily choices, small kindnesses, and the courage to face our own darkness." As the event resumed its normal rhythm, Jake felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Not because he'd been vindicated, but because he'd faced his past without letting it define his future. He saw his journey reflected in the faces around him, not as a finished story of redemption, but as an ongoing process of growth and healing. Later that night, as he helped clean up, he found Amanda's phone on the bar. On the screen was a drafted social media post about his past, never sent. Instead, he found a new message in its place. "Witness something unexpected at Bistro Bell tonight." Maybe change isn't just a word after all. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't meant to be, but it was acknowledgement, and sometimes that's where real change begins.